This is the Live in 5 show. February 19th marks the day when we celebrate Japanese Remembrance Day.
Welcome to our special edition for this special occasion.
I'm Sophia.
And I'm Sean.
Let's take a moment to become familiar with the history of the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor and the United States reaction in both declaration of war and establishment of imprisoned camps.
On December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched an attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. In the following months, hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to internment camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. But the feelings that paved the road to internment began long before the attack. For more than 80 years, Asian immigrants were viewed as economic threats, spurring various laws that effectively banned them from the country. For those who made it to America, the lingering resentment culminated after Pearl Harbor. Motivated by vocal outcries from politicians and military officials, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, empowering the U.S. Army to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. He later formed the War Relocation Authority to establish 10 permanent camps, housing nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans, mostly from the western United States. 2/3 of those interned were native-born American citizens. With only 6 days to dispose of their possessions, residents were forced to sell their belongings and even their homes for small sums of money. Internment camps were often situated in isolated deserts, prone to harsh weather, and surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Within the barracks, internees lived in small one-room apartments with little privacy and constant surveillance. They were only given a standard army cot, blankets, and a small heating stove. Despite these difficult living conditions, internees tried to establish a sense of community, creating newspapers, schools, churches, and farms. Even in the face of persecution, young men came forth to join the military. Nearly 33,000 Japanese Americans served during World War II, many of whom became highly decorated for their valor in battle. Yet as the war continued, public opinion worsened against Japanese Americans. Only 35% of the country thought they should be allowed home once the war was over. This sentiment kept the camps open for over 3 years. On December 17, 1944, the government announced that Japanese American evacuees could return to their homes. When they did return, they found their homes looted and their possessions gone. With work almost impossible to come by, many fell homeless and destitute. At the time, the federal government offered no assistance for those attempting to rebuild their lives. It would take over 40 years before President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, paying reparations to each victim of internment.
No payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
Now we'll take some time to hear from Japanese American citizens who share their personal stories about the internment camps.
On February 19th of 1942, 2 months after Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which led to the mass incarceration of over 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry.
For me, it's a remembrance of my father and mother and 2 sisters who went from Los Angeles, Boyle Heights, and were incarcerated at Post in Arizona, where babies would cry every night. There was no air conditioning. And later, my father, because he was a no-no, was transferred by train to Tule Lake, California, where I was born.
So it took several months to build the regular concentration camps like Manzanar and Tule Lake. So what they did was they had the people first go to the assembly centers, and there was one in LA County called Santa Anita, and over there we had 18,000 people. Now, 8,000 of them lived in the stables and 10,000 lived in the barracks that were built in the parking lot.
As we continue to strive for a more perfect union, we must continue to remain vigilant. And that is why I ask you to join me in remembering this day in our nation's history.
Time now to take a look at the personal reflections of Tetzlaff Trojans.
So, what is Japanese Remembrance Day? Japanese Remembrance Day is remembering the people who came from Japan who have impacted the world in great ways. Now, let's see what our Trojans think the significance of Japanese Remembrance Day is.
What is the significance of Japanese Remembrance Day?
Well, back in 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which interned Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. The American people here on the mainland felt that the Japanese would side with the Japanese in Japan, so just because of their nationality, they were interned, and people were uprooted from their homes, from their lives, and put in camps all across the United States. And I think it's just an important lesson for us to remember, so that we don't ever take a people based on a fear that they are just going to be turned against us, turned against American people, because most of them were American citizens. So I think it's a good day to remember that.
The significance of Japanese Remembrance Day is that we get to remember the people that were locked up by the U.S. government because they were involved in the Japanese, or they're supposedly involved in the Pearl Harbor. So.
It's when the Japanese were bombing Pearl Harbor, and that started a war. And they were imprisoned in internment camps, and that was very unfair because they had nothing to do with it.
During World War II, after the Pearl Harbor bombings, the USA took in many Japanese citizens into internment camps, even though the Japanese citizens were not directly involved with the Pearl Harbor bombings. There were more than 110,000 Japanese American citizens living in these internment camps. By the end of World War II, 1,862 people had passed away from being in these camps.
The Japanese Day of Remembrance is significant in acknowledging how reacting to a foreigner's attack through racial profiling on its own citizens can devastate families for years.
Take a moment today to remember how those American citizens suffered needlessly.
Thank you for joining us today on the Live in 5 show for our special edition of Japanese Remembrance Day. We wish you all a very good day.